Dr. Schmidt. I like to walk around a little bit more. I'm also going to be trying to man the computer here. So Dan brought us up to where we are in the spring of 2017. Oh, you can do that. That's fantastic. All right, so spring of 2017, I was living in Sandpoint, Idaho with my husband. And I'm just going to tell you a little bit of the origin story of Reclaim Idaho because I think it's useful to know how we got to where we are today. Actually, if you want to go to the next slide, and if we can make that video play, that'll give us the big picture, and then I'll bring it kind of back to, is the volume going to work? All right. Never mind. All right, we're not going to go through that. So I'll talk you through. We started in Sandpoint, Idaho, and we organized around a school levy election. You'll get a nice visual as we're going through. So we were living in Sandpoint. I'm a pediatric occupational therapist, I should mention. And when I say occupational therapist, it's not about getting kids lemonade stands. It's about helping people live their lives to the fullest. And what I saw in my practice, day in and out, was children unable to live their life to the fullest because their families were unable to live their life to the fullest. Oftentimes I worked with kids with disabilities, so more often than not, they were covered through Medicaid, but their parents were not. And kids always operate in a system, right? If you can't get the child help, or if you have parents who are dealing with chronic illness or mental illness or substance abuse, or perhaps you're living with grandparents and they have chronic illness, you can't as a child get better if you're living in this system where there's illness and a lack of access to healthcare. So I saw that day in and out, and I could tell you, I had one little boy, and I could tell when his grandmother was having an MS relapse because his behavior would be so off and he would be struggling so much because I just knew at home she wasn't interacting with him, food wasn't getting on the table, she was really having these struggles through no fault of her own, but she couldn't get access to treat her MS. So back to the school levy election, we were, I obviously am super involved in pediatrics, and there was a school levy election coming up for a vote that looked like it might not pass. Its failure would have meant that 3 schools were going to close, over 300 educators in Sandpoint were going to lose their jobs, and for me, those schools were the cornerstone for some of these kids I worked with. That was the only hot meals they were getting during the week, that was the only shower, that was sometimes the only adult that showed them that they had any value. So it was tremendously important to me. So myself and my husband, Garrett, who couldn't be here tonight, and Luke Mabel, the 3 of us co-founded Reclaim Idaho, we got on the horn and we said, this looks like it might not pass. Like, what are we going to do? So we decided, we'll just organize this door knocking campaign. We'll do something, because it was also this time with the national political climate where none of us wanted to feel helpless anymore. And we knew that in taking action, we wouldn't feel so helpless. So we organized this weekend-long door knocking campaign, and we were shocked when about 60 volunteers showed up, Saturday and Sunday, and in a weekend, we knocked on almost 3,000 doors. A levy election that had failed several months prior with about a 64% failure rate passed at about a 67% rate. So we realized, wow, not only did this make a difference, but there's a ton of energy to be harnessed here. What are we going to do next? So we formed Reclaim Idaho, which believes in 3 things. To me, they're pretty consensus building issues. Strong public schools, continued access to public lands, and healthcare for working families. So after the school levy election, we kind of were sitting down, we were drawing up our platform, what does Reclaim Idaho want to do, and where do we want to go next? And this was around the time when there was this huge push to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act. So there was a lot of energy around healthcare last year, in 2017, when we first kicked off the campaign. And Luke and Garrett had gone out to drinks, and they came home with what they told me was this brilliant idea. And Garrett and I actually owned a 1977 Tioga camper. I'm sure some of you have seen it now. And they wanted to paint it green and drive around the state and talk to people about healthcare, and particularly expanding Medicaid. I, of course, thought it was a horrible idea, and not because I didn't believe in the expansion of Medicaid, but I had driven in that Tioga camper before, and that thing's a death trap. And we'd broken down several times and just trying to go 10, 15 miles at a spurt. So I was like, you want to do what? So, long story short, we paint the camper green, and I go along to our very first event in Bonners Ferry, We go door knocking, we meet with this group of folks in Bonners Ferry, we go door knocking, and the very first door I knock on is this woman who is 63 years old. She had worked for 35 years. She had retired early to take care of 2 grandchildren. She couldn't afford the Cobra health insurance payments, so she crossed her fingers and was waiting to get on Medicare. Like I mentioned, she cared for 2 young granddaughters. Her mentally ill sister also lived in the home, as did her husband. In that time, she developed colon cancer. They spent their entire life savings treating that. All they had left for assets was their home. After treating the colon cancer and surviving, she developed fissures in her colon, which the doctors told her were going to rupture, poison her blood, and it would be fatal. So she was left with this decision: do I sell my home to get treatment, and in doing so, make my sister, my husband, and my grandchildren homeless, or do I die? This is the first woman I'm talking to. And she is crying to me, and she says, I'm like, how can I help? And she says, do you know what a GoFundMe page is? That's what the social worker told me to do. I don't know what that is. They told me I could divorce my husband, I could move to Washington. These are the options that the social worker gave her. Meanwhile, we're thinking, and she says, the other thing she said is they told me to call my senator and to call my representatives, and I've done that, and they haven't done anything for me. So I, of course, was sobbing with this woman, and she said, just keep fighting. Just knowing that there's somebody out here fighting for us, fighting for me, fighting for other people like me, gives me some hope. So I'll be damned if I wasn't going to keep going on that tour after that moment. And we'll show you some pictures. The Medicaid mobile did break down, but I'm pretty sure God was on our side for all of those breakdowns, and I'll tell you those stories as we go. So I think we have the next picture is, oh, you can go ahead in front of that. So we kicked off in Sandpoint. Oh, here we go. You can go to the next slide, actually. Breakdowns. So the very top image, actually 2, so like I said, God was on our side, I'm pretty sure, because we were fighting for these people that through no fault of their own are in the coverage gap. So on the top are 2 young men, both of whom are University of Idaho educated engineers. And so when we broke down on the side of the highway, they happened to be driving by. They're also childhood friends of my husband and Luke's. So they stopped and they repaired the car. All 3 of these images are actually in the same day. That was a rough day. The heat's not good for the Medicaid mobile. So we carry on and we break down again. When you're driving up through on Highway 55 towards McCall, and there's that turnoff to Brundage, and it's the only place in the road that you can turn off, like within 15 miles of that case. So we broke down right at that turnoff and were able to get off the highway, which was a blessing. This gentleman in the blue shirt happened to be a physician down in Boise and has become one of our consultants on this campaign because he's gotten involved. And the third time we broke down that day was going up the hill, Horseshoe Bend, and another one of Garrett's childhood friends happened to be driving by, and he stopped and was able to help us. So it was all very serendipitous, and I do feel like this whole campaign for us has been really a blessing, and I feel like there has been just kind of angels along the way because we are fighting for something good. So maybe as woo-woo as it sounds, to me it gives me motivation to keep going when the stakes feel against us. Go ahead. All right, so one thing we did as we were going on this tour is we just stopped and talked to people about their health care, and it turns out in Idaho it's pretty desperate. This is Ken. He is a grocer in American Falls, and his wife has lung cancer. They had actually moved back in with his parents because they had lost everything treating her cancer. Again, the social worker told them that they could get divorced and potentially his wife would be able to, get on Medicaid because she didn't qualify because he was still working to pay off previous medical bills. You can go to the next one. Oh, this is Joseph. One interesting thing, like Dan mentioned, so emergency care is covered, so that's great, but there are no subsequent therapies covered. So Joseph broke his hand. He was an electrician. He broke his hand. He was able to get the emergency treatment, the casting and everything, but because he couldn't go to any therapies afterward, he lost enough function that he could no longer be an electrician. He is now working as a truck driver and is in the Medicaid coverage gap. He's a family of 4, just to note. So he has a family of 4, and the coverage limits, if you make more than $5,000 and less than $25,000 a year, you were in the coverage gap. So just to give you some perspective of trying to raise a family, and you know, there's so much context to that. So again, you know, he's out working, he's doing the best he can, and I can hear people thinking, well, why doesn't he just work harder? So you have to think about the fact that his wife is at home caring for the children, he now has a disability that he can't get treatment for. So there's a lot of these contextual issues that we don't really think about when people who oppose this just say, well, people should work harder. I can tell you that Joseph was working 40 plus hours a week. He was driving for logging trucks seasonally, he was driving for farmers, he was doing what he could, but the deck was really stacked against him. Go ahead. So, after driving around the state and talking to folks, you know, there was a lot of energy around the Medicaid expansion. And there was a lot of reasons, you know, when we talked to people, there's a lot of reasons why it seemed like we might not be able to pull this off. Specifically, the money. Everyone say to be able to do a ballot initiative, you need millions of dollars because you need to pay to get signature gatherers out there. One thing we had been doing is we were going all around the state was meeting with people in all these different communities we were going to, and like I said, there was so much energy. So, you know, we kind of used those connections that we made to build this network of volunteer organizations all around the state. And we decided, you know, I think we should do this. And we came back to Moscow and we met with Dan, and he said, I think you guys are crazy. You know, these are all the reasons why it's going to be nearly impossible to do it. But I'll support you guys, you know, and it was really funny talking to Dan, especially looking back, and he would just be like, yeah, sounds like you guys have your minds made up, because we were just these optimists, you know, obviously to drive around the state in a 77 camper, you have to be an optimist, but, you know, we were just these optimists that thought, like, by God, we have to do something for these folks out there. So the picture on the left is Dan being the first official signer of the petition once we got this all printed off, and it's, of course, a bit of a process. You submit a bill to the Secretary of State, they give you some minor edits, and then they send it back to you. So after we finally got it back in December, Dan, we called Dan and he said, yeah, I'm at pool night at Mingles, you can meet me down there. So we all three huffed it down to Mingles and joined Dan, and he was the first signer on the petition, which was pretty exciting. And then the picture on the right is our Moscow kickoff, and you can see Dan has a board that says, I support Medicaid expansion because it makes sense for all of Idaho. So, many of the reasons, again, people said that we were not going to be successful. You know, we were gathering signatures in the dead of winter, so obviously there's not like a farmer's market where you can just go sit and wait for progressives to walk by you. You know, and again, we didn't have millions of dollars. And the legislature, after the successful referendum of the Luna laws, changed the rules so that a ballot initiative now required not only 6% of total registered voters around the state, but 6% of 18 of 35 districts around the state. So it of course requires a statewide organization, but we were like, that's great, we got that. You know, so we were pretty tickled. But yeah, there were certainly some challenges. You know, we connected with a group in Maine so 32 states initially passed the Medicaid expansion. Within the past year, Maine voted through a ballot initiative to expand Medicaid. So we connected with the organizers of that. They were brilliant and got almost all of their signatures that were required the day of the presidential election 2016. So the top picture there, we didn't, of course, have that, but we did have a school levy election. So we sent teams out all around the state during school levy elections back in March. And so in Lewiston, in one day, we got 900 signatures. Just to give you all here in Moscow some perspective, because I see a lot of familiar faces that supported the cause. We did a day of action here in Moscow and just kind of spontaneously organized tables all throughout the city, and you folks were able to gather about 900 signatures in a day yourself. So that's pretty incredible. I will mention, we did in the end of February partner with an organization called the Fairness Project, which is a national organization that supports the causes of working families. So we did partner with them, and they hired some paid signature gatherers down in southern and southeastern Idaho. So in the end, 96% of the signatures that we gathered were by volunteers to qualify, and then they got the additional 4% to get over the hump. Go ahead.